Thank you for joining us today. I am Hoda Mahmoudi, the holder of the Bahá'í Chair for World Peace at the University of Maryland, and I am very glad that you have joined us for this very important event today, a book discussion. I'd like to first thank Dr. Kate Seaman, our Assistant Director, for organizing today's event. It's my pleasure to have you join us for this book talk, hosted in celebration of a timely and important new publication from the Bahá'í Chair. If you can see the next slide, the book is entitled Global Climate Crisis, Seeking Environmental Justice and Climate Equality, and it's edited by Dr. Seaman and myself. Published by Elgar Publishing, and the volume is comprised of 7 chapters that brings together diverse voices to explore the ethical, political, and social dimensions of global climate emergency, asking not only how we respond to environmental degradation, but how do we do so justly, equitably, and inclusively. Our conversation today builds on the book's central insight that the climate crisis is not only an environmental issue, but also a profound question of justice. Who bears the burden for environmental harm in a world that is highly interdependent? Whose voices are heard in shaping solutions? And how might communities around the world imagine and create more just, resilient, and sustainable futures? To help us think through these questions, we are honored to welcome 2 distinguished scholars whose work bridges ethics, science, policy, and community engagement. I'm sorry to say that unfortunately, due to unforeseen circumstances, Dr. Tiffany Betts-Razavi is unable to join us today. So with that, it's my great pleasure to now introduce our 2 speakers. I will introduce them and then each will follow the other. The first speaker is Dr. Ben Mylius, who is a postdoctoral fellow in ethics in society at the McCoy Family Center for Ethics in Society at Stanford University. He earned his PhD in environmental political theory from Columbia University and a Master's of Laws from Yale Law School following his undergraduate studies in Australia. Dr. Mylius's work explores the intersection of climate storytelling and imagination. At Stanford, he is developing a book that examines how communities can use creative and ethical tools to envision their own just and resilient climate futures. He also serves as an interdisciplinary ethics fellow with the Stanford Doerr School of Sustainability. The title of his chapter in our featured book today is Engaging Ethically with Narratives from Historically Marginalized Cultures in Response to Climate Change. Following Dr. Mylius's presentation will be Dr. Na'Taki Osborne Jelks. Dr. Na'Taki Osborne Jelks is an assistant professor of environmental and health sciences at Spelman College and co-founder of the West Atlanta Watershed Alliance, a community-based environmental justice organization. Her research investigates urban environmental health disparities, the effects of climate change on marginalized communities, and the ways race, place, and social context shape outcomes. Dr. Jelks' work emphasizes community-based and participatory approaches that empower residents to monitor local conditions, generate actionable data, and revitalize degraded spaces into healthy, sustainable places. She currently leads the Urban Heat Atlanta a collaborative research initiative mapping urban heat islands in Atlanta. Her work has been supported by the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency and major foundations including Rockefeller, Robert Wood Johnson, JPB, and the National Science Foundation. The title of her chapter in the book is Urban Heat Islands and Associated Health Effects for Vulnerable Populations, exploring data, technology, and community-engaged research to advance health equity. We will begin now with Dr. Ben Mylius. Welcome.
Thanks very much, Professor Mahmoudi. It's lovely to be here with you all today. Greetings from New York, where I am at the moment, and yesterday was snowing. So I gather there's quite a diverse group of folks all across the place and maybe some more sun out the window for you than me. But wanted to just start briefly by saying thanks, of course, to all of you, especially to the editors of the volume. I feel really particularly excited to be part of a conversation which is very apt in the circumstances, I think, between folks from all kinds of backgrounds and experiences and also all kinds of methodological approaches and engagements. That's a really great place to start. What I'll aim to do today, because I'm really obviously excited to hear from Professor Jelks and also to have a broader conversation with everyone, is aim to just give a bit of an overview of the chapter that I contributed to the book, which as a proviso from the start comes from a broadly theoretical background, so less practice oriented and community grounded in case studies or things like that than I know some of the others are. But the central question that I have been interested in for quite a while now is really able to be stated pretty simply, and it is, if the stories that we in a particular culture, I'll use the term we here broadly, referring to myself, but also invite folks to think through what that could mean in their contexts. If the stories we tell ourselves about our relationship to the natural world as human beings are destructive, how might we come up with better ones? So that's, I find interesting as a question because it seems simple in some respects, but I think is deceptively simple, especially when we start thinking about the ethics and the cultural questions that emerge with that question, with that broader inquiry. Two of the possibilities in particular that often come to mind for folks that raise issues are as follows. The first one is sometimes folks say, okay, if we need a new story, perhaps we can just invent one, make it up from whole cloth. That's problematic, unfortunately, for a range of reasons, but one that has stuck with me is that it really repeats this part of the intellectual or cultural move that I think has gotten us where we are, which is the idea that it's possible or desirable to completely cut ourselves off from history and the experiences of past cultures, philosophies, and communities. So that's off the table, I think. And then the second possibility is that often comes to mind for folks seems to be something like, well, looking around in the world, there are a bunch of other folks and communities with different experiences than mine. Some of them out there in the world, as I travel around, seem to have better stories than my culture does, so why don't I take them? And I imagine folks can already hear in that language how the language of taking in particular, how that immediately becomes problematic because of the way that it taps into appropriation and exploitation. But similarly, I think it's also, more practically speaking, problematic because it doesn't really work. Cultural stories are rooted in places and people and specifics and experiences that are really often embodied and not just theoretical. And so the idea that we might take a story from culture A and bring it across to culture B to solve a problem that we have is tricky. So with that as the general background, what I have been interested in, and here's perhaps an opportunity for me to say a little bit about my own background, as someone who grew up in Australia in a white non-Indigenous family, I should flag, but has long been really taken and have long felt as though there's a huge amount that I've learned from working alongside Indigenous Australian students and colleagues, and have also been in the US now about 10 years and encountered a whole lot of other different cultures, communities, and histories. So with that as my own personal background, the question that has interested me has been trying to work out what sorts of theoretical resources in the again, broadly speaking, Western tradition, but specifically in the ecofeminist tradition that critiques and engages with and aims to build on that tradition. What resources from there might exist that we can draw on as we're trying to think through this thorny question of what it looks like to engage across cultures and stories in these ways? And the specific thinker that I'll talk a little bit about today, whose work I have gotten a huge amount out of and who excitingly also was Australian, is an ecofeminist named Val Plumwood. She wrote a whole lot of work before her, unfortunately, death at a relatively early age, I think in 2008. So I'd really encourage folks to look into some of that. One of her most famous pieces of work is entitled Feminism and the Mastery of Nature. And that's the work that I'll draw mostly on today. So I've found Val Plumwood's work really useful in starting some of these inquiries for myself, because a big part of the project that she's involved in is trying to articulate what are some of the logical structures in an abstract way that often characterize ethically problematic relationships between ideas, cultural traditions, and communities. And it's worth flagging two things at this point. The first one is that that the language she is using herself is, if you will, from the master tradition. So it's the language of, in some senses, formal logic. And happy to chat about how that works and how I understand her to have done that. But I think it's really powerful because it allows for conversations amongst folks who are coming from, so to speak, dominant traditions, but wanting to challenge those from within those traditions. And then the second thing to say that I've always been extremely impressed by in Plumwood's work is that she was an exceptional logician in her own right, and therefore was able to speak within the world of academic logic, which is itself an extremely specific intellectual world, in ways that lived this significant ethical feminist commitment that she had. With that in mind, the central idea that I have taken and found really generative in Plumwood's writing is the idea that a lot of the starting points of, for the sake of this, I'll just say Western thinking, have been dominated by broadly binaristic reasoning and relationships. Plumwood talks about a series of different ways that those binary relationships can be thought about. I'll list them, but I won't, just for reasons of time, go into them all in detail. They are backgrounding in the first place. Backgrounding is, as the name suggests, taking one entity or culture and viewing all other entities and natures and cultures just as background for that one, as center stage. And so a concrete example of that might be using the language of natural resources, the idea that nature as it exists in the world is just for human use. The second logical feature of those problematic relationships she talks about is radical exclusion, which is this idea of, again, as the name suggests, trying to think and talk about the relationships between entities or cultures as if they can be radically, a bright line can be drawn between them, or one of them or the other can be held at arm's length. The third one is what she calls incorporation, which is this idea of defining the second culture, if you will, or entity in the pair of entities solely with respect to the first. So again, an example of that would be to say there are humans and then there are non-human animals. So implicitly there, the second category is being defined more or less exclusively by reference to the first. The fourth problematic logical relationship that she talks about is implicit in the first three, and that's instrumentalization. That, again, is a term I imagine is familiar to a lot of folks, but it effectively means starting from one position and viewing other cultures, traditions, or natures as tools for use, not as subjects in their own right. And then the final, and I think quite significant, problematic logical feature she identifies of these conversations, especially in the context of this question of intercultural and intercommunity dialogue, is homogenization. So starting from one cultural position and then implicitly or explicitly talking about other cultural positions as if they can be reduced to just one single idea. So a concrete example of that would be talking, for instance, in terms of Native American philosophy, generally, without acknowledging that, in fact, there's a huge amount of diversity politically, experientially, and otherwise in Native American communities, as one example. Now, that I understand is all quite abstract, as I mentioned, from a philosophical perspective. But the reason that I've found that really helpful is that as admittedly a top-down theoretical thinker myself, it's been one language for coming into some of these conversations that can then wouldn't work for everyone, I'm certain, but for me as someone, as I say, theoretically oriented, has been helpful to try to work out how might some of those pitfalls show up in the kind of work that I do, and what might it look like to then try to be wary of them and think about alternatives before getting, as best one can, entangled in them. So to return to that initial question that I asked, what if the stories that we, again, in inverted commas, think have about nature and humans are destructive or problematic or misleading, where might we find others? And then moving into this question of thinking about, all right, I think there are other cultures and traditions that have really significant engagements with this question and come to very different answers, lead their lifeways in really different directions. What does it look like to stand within a tradition that's often been the dominating tradition and learn with and walk alongside, or try to walk alongside those others? What strikes me perhaps as the most significant takeaway is the idea, as I alluded to earlier, that it's not possible to just take an idea or a story or even the concrete details of a specific practice of another community, an Australian Aboriginal community from Southern Australia, for example, or a community from Northern Canada, and try to adopt that without more work being done. So to offer a concrete example, let me draw briefly on some work by an Australian Aboriginal thinker and writer whose work I found really generative, Auntie Mary Graham, who's of the Kombumerri people. So Auntie Graham describes two, what she calls basic precepts in the context of describing her understanding of Aboriginal thinking about cosmology and philosophy in the Australian context. The first one is the land is the law, and the second one is you are not alone in the world. Those, I think, are really powerful and evocative principles, and Auntie Graham goes on to talk a lot about the way in which they show up and ramify in the context of the Indigenous, specific Aboriginal Australian context that she's talking about. What I think is interesting in the context of the conversation here is that they might sound like principles that are abstract enough to be applied anywhere. And therein, I think, lies the trap, or the first question to be aware of. In the first place, that's because land or country, as Aboriginal Australian writers often refer to it, doesn't just mean land as a resource or a standing reserve. It means something much thicker and more relational. And it has to do with embedded stories of people and places in the specific environments and landscapes in, again, northern New South Wales or far north Queensland, or specific places on the Australian continent. And so that means that it's not something that can just be applied in the way that, say, claims in Western legal systems might be applied to think about land. Part of what it also seems to mean to me is that it suggests a couple of different ways that those 5 principles or problematic logical relationships I outlined before might show up if we start to think about claims like that one, or discussions like that one. The first move would be something like searching for equivalence, but from the, so to speak, dominant culture into the other. So saying something like, I wonder if I can identify an Aboriginal version of rights or a social contract. I'm still doing some thinking, and I'd be really interested to hear other folks' perspectives in the Q&A about the ethical possibilities and challenges of doing the inverse move, of saying, here is a concept or a practice in Indigenous philosophy, and it might be interesting to look through or look for an equivalent or a seed of a starting point for something similar in broadly construed Western philosophy. But I'd be really keen, as I say, to hear whether folks think that bidirectional move is different ethically or not. But in any event, the question of finding equivalence is tricky. The second question is, or the second move that's tricky in that specific context, is extracting universal principles. So saying, okay, great, this idea of being not alone in the world is something that we quote unquote can now apply anywhere. That too falls into those ideas of backgrounding, homogenizing, separating, and things like that. And then the third, and in lots of ways trickiest, is reproducing the dualism even as we try to escape it. So in talking in simple terms about, okay, these ideas over there with those people can be brought into these ideas over here with our people, doesn't do justice to the complexities of all of the histories and relationships that are involved in these conversations. Let me just talk briefly about an alternative, if you will, on the other end of the spectrum that sometimes, or perhaps more than sometimes, also I think shows up in environmental thought that can be tricky, which is, for want of a better term, fetishization or oversimplistic engagement with, in the context that I've been, as I say, exploring and learning into Australian Aboriginal philosophy. That broadly, as the name suggests, involves looking, I think, through starry eyes, for want of a better term, at another culture and imagining it in oversimplified terms such that it's possible to say, hey, wow, I think these folks have solved all of the problems. The Indigenous philosophers I've spoken with concretely about that idea have often come back and said, listen, that's almost as bad as the first set of responses, but for different reasons. Perhaps the impulse is appreciated, but in practical terms, that move to say, wow, we think you've got it all figured out, downplays the, again, political, ethical, relational complexity and conflict within, for instance, the Ghana culture in Southern Australia. And that's not a helpful move because it flattens and homogenizes the other context and lived experiences of folks with whom one's trying to engage. So that's about 15 minutes for me. There are just a few other things that I'd like to say before I pass on to Professor Jelks about the chapter that I've explored. And they consist in opening what it might look like to dig into, admittedly, some of those fairly abstract theoretical ideas to start moving towards more practical engagements or questions. And this goes perhaps a little beyond the chapter as it's presented in the book, but it's something I've been thinking a lot about myself over the last few months. Perhaps the most interesting part of the reflections for me over the last few months has been, in fact, thinking more specifically about the practical ways that these intellectual ideas, as I understand them in Australian Aboriginal philosophy, as in the work of, as I say, Mary Graham and also Tyson Yunkaporta, who's another thinker from the Apalek clan that I've found, whose work I found really generative to engage with and learn from, is that so many of these things, as described by those two thinkers at least, are practical. They don't show up in the Indigenous communities those two writers are talking about primarily as abstract ideas or concepts or analytical frameworks. They show up really through rituals, practices, relationships, conversations, and lived experiences that folks in the community on the ground are having day to day. And that suggests to me that perhaps, to go back to that fraught question of equivalence or looking for equivalencies from one direction to another that I mentioned earlier, it's been interesting to wonder if part of what the learning from engaging with, as I say, specific Indigenous philosophers has for me been, here are all of the ways that we in our communities embody these questions and lived experiences and ethos of relating to the natural world in a non-destructive way through practices. Then, if I can close that chain of loop of logic, we might ask, are there seeds of places or practices in the quote unquote Western tradition that similar things are already happening, which we could engage with, as well as engaging or working to learn how to walk alongside other cultures in their thinking and living about these questions. So very briefly, I'll say this perhaps to end, some of the most interesting and generative work I've encountered since finishing the chapter has in fact been people talking very much in terms of stories. For academics, I think, especially social scientists and others, the idea of stories and narratives can sometimes seem a little simplistic. And I think that's something really worth pushing back on. Story or narrative, as I'm thinking about it here, is much more the kind of thing one would have around a dinner table or a campfire or a conversation after seeing an amazing film or a play. Reflecting and engaging in a lived and live way on a narrative, an account of how humans have been relating to the natural world that is either problematic, in which case we can look at it, let's say the narrative of Icarus flying too high and falling into the ocean, as one famous and very old Western story, or more positively, stories of folks who are trying things like regenerative agriculture or using working with climate migrants in their own communities to tell different kinds of stories about solidarity and care and things like that. So perhaps I'll leave it there. Thank you all very much again for being here today. I understand that's a theoretical deep dive, but I'm really looking forward to Professor Jelks's discussion of her chapter, and then we'll be really glad to hear from and talk with all of you after that. Thanks very much. Over to you, Professor Mahmoudi.
Thank you so much, Dr. Mylius. And I really think that you've raised some very important issues that perhaps we'll be able to discuss during the Q&A. Now we will hear from Professor Jelks.
Thank you so much. And thank you also for the invitation to not only participate today, but to be a part of this great book. Thank you so much, Dr. Ben. I so appreciated what you talked about. There were a few threads that had me thinking about some of the things that I want to talk about. And first, I'll just kind of start a little bit with story and how important that is to my work. As an environmental health scientist, I am working on the front lines with a lot of communities who are impacted by environmental hazards and stressors. And what I'm finding more and more is that the storytelling component of our work is critically important. When I'm working with communities, what I'm finding that is so important to do is to lift up the lived experiences of communities as they are experiencing impacts of the built and natural environments, and how those impacts are affecting health, well-being, quality of life, as well as the quality of our local environments. And not only that, that lived experience is paired with local community knowledge that I find has been critical for the work that I do. In environmental health, it's traditionally a field that is very quantitative in nature, but there are a number of scholars who are beginning to really push back on that to make sure that environmental health research is very mixed methods, that we're bringing qualitative approaches into the work, that we're bringing social science methodologies into the work, such that the quantitative can also be paired with the contextual, if you will. And that's a lot of what we get from the qualitative work. And so in my chapter, this contribution was really about first talking about climate change and the impact that it has on vulnerable populations, specifically communities of color and low-income populations who are disproportionately impacted by climate change. These are the populations who we talk about being hit first and worst in the context of climate change. But not only was it sort of a focus on the impacts, of climate change on these populations, with a special emphasis on exposure to extreme heat, we also try to explore ways that local communities have been engaged in data collection. And this data collection has been important not only to elevate the lived experiences that people are having and to sort of put it in the language of decision makers, but also this data is important for helping to tell stories, stories about the impacts, as well as they serve, these stories and the data serve as sort of a launching point for communities to begin to think about solutions, solutions that oftentimes can, include government entities, but also solutions that are led and headed up by impacted communities. This idea that communities are not necessarily looking for the cavalry to come in and save them, but they are looking to work with government entities, with academic institutions, with nonprofits and others in a way such that they can co-design what the solutions look like, and implement those solutions together. And so a core piece of my chapter was focused on spotlighting a local initiative that I co-lead. It's called Urban Heat ATL. And Urban Heat ATL is a project that was started in 2021 with the idea that community members and students, college students, excuse me, in the Atlanta metropolitan area could join together to collect data about urban heat islands in the city. Now, I will say that urban heat islands are not caused by climate change, but they do exacerbate the extreme temperatures that we are facing as a result of climate change. And so this seemed like a good place to start with our research as we were looking at the ways that urban planning over the years has negatively impacted communities of color and lower income communities, particularly through things like redlining and urban renewal, and specifically with redlining, a policy that was developed in the 1930s, and it was outlawed in the 1960s, but we still see the impacts of redlining today. Essentially, this was something that the federal government did to sort of highlight where or what communities were ripe for different types of investments. And redlining was a process that was used by the insurance industry to make decisions on how it would lend to people who were looking to purchase homes. And it's done much more than that. It has impacted things like the accumulation of generational wealth in communities. We see communities of color not as not kind of not being at the same scale as other communities with respect to home ownership, over the years since the policy was started in the 1930s. And so not only do we not see the same levels of home ownership in communities of color and lower income populations, we also see that there is some correlation in many cities, including Atlanta, with respect to environmental hazards. Atlanta has been included in a number of different studies, some that have focused on exposure to extreme heat, others that have focused on things like the availability of parks, green spaces, and tree coverage, as well as studies that have looked at things like air pollution. And the thesis or the findings from all of those studies that Atlanta has been included in demonstrate that we see the historically redlined neighborhoods, the ones where we see the highest temperatures, where we see highest levels of air pollution, and where we also see some of the lowest tree canopy coverage or some of the lowest percentages of land that is covered by green space, parks, and or trees. And so we recognize that this association is a critical piece for us to sort of start with as we think about ways that communities can be involved in being solutions to some of the challenges that they face. And so much of what we talk about in this chapter, and I did co-author this chapter with J.C. Gonzalez, who is a colleague from the Meharry Medical College in Nashville, Tennessee. And it was very interesting to partner with JC on this work because his work is very much focused on data. Looking at big data, the development of mobile applications and other tools that can be used to collect data, the designing of data dashboards that can help to demonstrate what health disparities, look like from a spatial perspective and that sort of thing. And so this work that we are doing in Atlanta was really nice to pair with his focus on data because we are developing or collecting community-generated data. And we're using two approaches that I want to lift up. One is we use a community-based participatory research approach in which the community members who are most impacted by the phenomenon that we were studying, in this case, exposure to extreme heat, are seen as participants, in the research study in which they are co-learners in the process. They help to develop the research question. The research question started with something of interest to the community. And not only are community members involved in the data collection, they're also involved in the data analysis, visualization, and using that data to develop recommendations or solutions for change. And so this is, in the context of research, sort of different from traditional research that might involve place or local places, and might also involve local community residents, but not necessarily in the vein that those community residents are helping to collect the data, helping to analyze and visualize the data, and then using that data to develop recommendations and solutions for change. So another approach that we also use is one that's called street science. The idea behind street science is that you're pairing sort of scientific techniques with local knowledge. And the point behind doing this street science is so that we can improve scientific inquiry, but also to improve the quality of environmental health decision making. And we do that by, again, bringing together this local community knowledge and lived experiences of folks who are living in places that are impacted by environmental harms and risks, and engaging them in the process. Their voice is shining through that process by virtue of the fact that we are investigating something of interest to those communities, of interest and concern to those communities, and that they are key parts of the research team. One other approach that I'll just mention that also applies to this work is an approach that we call community science. And there are lots of similarities between community science and things like citizen science, if you've heard of that. Citizen science is, simply approaches in which professional scientists join together and work with members of the public, lay community, residents, and they don't necessarily, in traditional citizen science projects, they don't necessarily have to live in one area or another. One example is Cornell University has a Christmas bird count every year. And so they invite people from all over the country, all over the United States to take note of the types of birds that they see in their local regions. So, just this idea that laypersons who are not scientists can participate in taking some observations that scientists can then use to, help us to understand things like, what biodiversity is like in bird populations. This is the type of approach that we use, with the exception of the fact that community science is really sort of embedded in those places, again, where people are most impacted by problems and challenges. So it's very, there are some alignments with this street science approach that I just mentioned. Again, this idea that local lived experience matters, that local community knowledge matters, but not only that, there are scientific techniques that we're engaging in. And I think about working with lay community residents really in the same way that I think about working with undergraduate students who I teach, science too. And so we teach those undergraduate, students how to collect different types of data. And we can do the same thing with community residents. And so with our project, Urban Heat ATL, the idea is that we have been pairing community members and students with low-cost sensors and mobile applications that go along with those low-cost sensors that allow them to walk or bike, just a path, or what we call treks, in a local community. And with the aid of this low-cost temperature sensor and the mobile application that is pulling from or drawing from the GPS units in our telephones and our cell phones, then we can measure temperature and then identify temperature and align it with the exact location or the GPS coordinates where that temperature was experienced. And so in this process, we have been trying to map areas of concern in terms of heat island hotspots within the city of Atlanta to get a better understanding of the communities that are hottest, that are experiencing the most challenges with respect to extreme heat. And we're using that data to work with local officials to help them to understand places where they might need to put cooling centers or places where they might need to implement solutions like planting trees or bringing more parks and green spaces online. The idea behind this work is that community members are getting a better understanding of what they're being exposed to in terms of looking at those numbers and temperatures, but they're also able to do some storytelling that's really important with respect to what they experience. And in this work, we found that a lot of times community members are not always seen as credible, are not always believed in terms of the claims that they make about the environmental hazards and stressors that impact their communities. And so with this community science and street science approach that we've taken to this work, it has allowed community residents to illuminate the claims that they've made by bringing the data alongside their stories to really amplify them. And we're getting some good responses in terms of local agencies and organizations. I will say that while we are getting some good responses, generally speaking, there are lots of challenges that are associated with using community-generated data, especially, for those who just don't believe, that data is valid. And so we've been pushing back against, some of those, concerns in terms of really being able to share, with people what our methodology is, what that approach is, and through that sort of pushing back, we've been able to really get an audience to listen to what community members are experiencing, and we are integrating some of their solutions into local planning efforts around community resilience. I think I'm just about at the end of my 15 minutes, so I will prepare to close. But the thing that I guess I will, just mention with respect to the approach that we took with this chapter was to really lift up the benefits of community engaged research approaches, to lift up the ways that community members can take, sort of an abstract concept with respect to, things like climate change and make sense of it by getting involved in data collection themselves. And what we've seen is that this it is used as a tool for education, a tool for mobilization and civic engagement. And also, it's something that helps us to further our understanding of local phenomenon from a scientific perspective as well. So I will stop there and turn it back over to Professor Mahmoudi or Professor Seaman to move us into the Q&A and discussion portion of the webinar. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Really appreciate both presentations. Lots to think about, and I hope that the audience will ask questions. So we'll start the Q&A now, and please put your questions into the Q&A function, and I will turn this session over to Dr. Seaman.
Thank you, Hoda. And thank you both again for your presentations. I think one of my favorite things from these volumes is the way that the chapters often speak to each other in different ways that we don't kind of foresee when we're putting the volume together. So it was really interesting to hear both of your presentations and see the connections between them. And I think the first question I want to pose to both of you is, how do we explore the ways in which climate change intersects with other social challenges to ensure that the impact on the most vulnerable populations is addressed? And maybe Professor Jelks, I'll start with you because I think that touches on your presentation.
Thank you for that question. One of the things that our chapter opened up with was really talking about sort of the multiplier effects of climate change, the fact that it really layers on top of other existing inequities in the context of things like economics, public health, as well as racial injustices. There is so much alignment between our destruction of the earth, and the way that certain populations have been treated and, quite honestly, impacted, by environmental pollution and degradation. And so when I think about some of the root causes of climate change, we see, some of the same, root causes in terms of, kind of a concept of extraction and how that extraction, really has driven our economy. It has driven, the way that, quite honestly, certain populations have been, brought unwillingly to this country, and, used to advance, growth and development, of the country from an economic standpoint. And so this multiplier effect of climate change really, brings together, all of these existing, kind of social challenges and inequities. And we unfortunately see in many cases the same communities that are vulnerable to things like income inequality, are the same communities that are disproportionately impacted by environmental pollution and by things like climate change.
Thank you.
Yes, apologies. Can you still hear me?
We can, yes.
Yes, great. I just wanted to switch to headphones. Excuse the technical fun. I'm speaking of extreme heat in a old apartment building in New York, and the radiator just decided to start hissing incredibly loudly. So I thought that might be an easy switch. Let me know if it becomes completely inaudible. That's a terrific question. I'll try to keep the answer brief. I think the first thing that comes to mind for me is that one of the reasons that I've really enjoyed engaging with some of these, admittedly, as I said, more abstract ideas about domination and the logic of that, is that, just like Professor Jelks mentioned, that provides a way to talk about how these things intersect. So to give one example, the backgrounding or homogenization, I found this especially useful with working with undergrads and other students to say, okay, listen, let's say it's a student who's really interested in gender questions, right? And says, this student comes to me and says, I'm really concerned about the way that these relationships or whatever it might be in this domain that I'm studying are reinforcing gender hierarchies, and usually men over women in some context or another, let's say. And so then a useful and interesting conversation to have with that student is to say, okay, great. And then can we or might we also explore how that same structure logically of, in this case, for the example, men dominating women in some domain or other, also seems to have echoes in the idea of humans dominating the natural environment in one way or another. And you sort of see the student start to think, okay, yikes, wow, how do I understand that echo, that intersection, that mapping? Do they reinforce each other? Does one cause the other? Where does this go? And from there, I think you can also ask the practical question about if there's a logical, so to speak, or conceptual echo or resonance in these different things. Maybe we can also ask how those other intersections appear in practice. So for instance, and that can also be something that we can use as a way to help translate very theoretical questions to the lived experience of, and with the lived experience of communities we might work with. So for instance, I'm thinking about heat, which Professor Jelks was talking about, engaging with a community or a student who's working with a community in Atlanta or somewhere else that's dealing with really extreme heat, and might be telling stories as part of their street science or citizen science about, listen, the elderly folks in our community can't find the cooling centers, or even if they know where they are, they can't get to them. What the heck? And so then having this interesting moment of saying, all right, well, that sounds like it's connected to a bunch of other questions, right? About urban planning and social infrastructure and the access of people who might check on those elderly folks and say, listen, we want to help you get to the cooling center. And so from there, you can open up practically into all these questions for students and others about how that, in the first place, apparently theoretical thing of a dominating relationship opens up into lots of different practical domains that they can start to trace. So that would be my thought on that front.
Thank you both. So the next question then ties in, I think, a bit with this idea of storytelling, and thinking about the pieces that we need to ensure that we activate culturally responsive climate governance, that engages with these communities that are disproportionately impacted, and kind of how we make sure that the stories are being told, but also that the stories are being heard by the right people. And maybe Ben will come to you first for that one.
Thanks. And I'll aim to keep this answer shorter because I get excited about some of these ideas and I know I can speak at length. I think, well, I mean, in fact, I'd be really keen to hear from Professor Jelks in a moment, but the one thought that I've reflected on a lot has been this idea of translating or trying to work as an intermediary between communities who are sharing stories, but may not always be sharing them in language that is accessible to policymakers, which is, I mean, in part also should be a challenge to the policymakers to work out why, as the people in the positions of power, they're not able to hear those stories. But even with that being the reality on the ground, I think then for me as an academic, it starts to ask this question, okay, if I have spent a long time trying to learn these languages of policy and legislation and advocacy that are often conversations couched in very abstract or high level terms, how can I, on the one hand, take those back to communities and folks in more everyday contexts who probably don't want to learn about cost benefit analysis in order to have a conversation about this stuff, but have insights into what we might as well call cost benefit analysis that I can try and learn and share and talk with them, and then go back to the folks in the legislation room and say, listen, this is what I'm hearing, and let me try to frame this in terms that I hope you will understand, and I also hope will honor the gravity of these stories that people are telling. But as I say, Professor Jelks, I'd be really interested to hear your sort of experience of that, specifically that question in your work.
Yeah, thank you for that. Yeah, it's been I guess interesting because in some cases in my work we have community members have decided that it's important for them to try to sort of adapt or to adopt the language of decision makers, so using things like data, maps, GPS coordinates of hazards and where the heat is impacting them the most. They tend to still rely, on their own, kind of oral traditions and things like that of, sharing, information. But they're also looking at these, really creative ways. And one approach that we're not using with the Urban Heat Project, but with another a piece of work that I'm engaged in with community members, they're using a tool called Photo Voice, in which they're using pictures to kind of to tell a narrative. The pictures, they're using to help characterize, the environmental hazards that are being experienced, in their communities, and sort of using, and they're creating narratives around those pictures, like titling the pictures, doing some analysis of those photos by really talking about the themes that they represent, and really tying that into, what some of the core problems are, or what are the root problems that are associated with those challenges, and then also, thinking about what some of those solutions can be. And so they're using that sort of data, which sometimes may not be as meaningful to the decision makers, but it's something that has some, wider appeal, to community audiences. And they're using, those photographs to teach, others about what it's like, to experience these environmental hazards, in their community. So I say all that to say that it's been an interesting journey to figure out how we can, both be very culturally, competent, with respect to helping communities to lift their voices. But, they've also been trying to figure out, alongside the things that resonate with us, how do we make this resonate, to those who have the resources to help us to address some of these challenges.
Thank you both. I'm going to take a question from the audience because I think it follows on quite nicely from what you were both just discussing. So this question comes from Malik Wilson, and he says, thank you both for your talks. how much does language matter in how we frame discussions about the environment? Even its terms, environment and climate, can seem far away and far off abstract. What success have both of you had with reframing, renaming, and resettling the language we use? Thank you.
I can start. So it's interesting that you say that. Thank you so much for the question. So I think there has been, especially recently, some attempts to try to reframe and reshape some of the language. I will say that prior to now, people have, still been sort of using environment, climate, those sorts of things, but trying to help people to connect to some of the impacts. So thinking about things like the flooding that we experience in a number of the communities, in Atlanta, the hot temperatures. So not really, trying to push too much in terms of using these overarching terms, but really trying to get to helping people to tap into the, the things that they're experiencing. And then we sort of, kind of put them under that umbrella, of environment or climate and that sort of thing. More recently, what I feel like has been happening, not necessarily so much at the local level, but in terms of how some of this work that we're doing is communicated, to other folks, especially into government agencies. People have been looking at environmental justice in particular and just trying to describe that more so than using the terminology, so that it's not, something that folks are getting, too caught up in terms of, the political context that we find ourselves in right now. So thinking about, these environmental problems that people are facing on the ground, but really, it's been about the reshaping and reframing of the language has been very much, in my experience, about the impacts that people are seeing, the observations that they're making, and tapping into those things. Again, elevating that local community knowledge. People may not call it environment, but they can talk about, what they're experiencing, in their communities, whether it's in, something that is a products of the built environment or the natural environment. So just tapping into the experience and the observations that people are making and giving that, light and elevation versus just, being focused on these umbrella terms.
That's really thought-provoking. What the question made me think of was, as I say, given being someone who's often working in quite theoretical or abstract academic spaces, it pulls in two directions. Because on the one hand, to this question of re-languaging or renewing language for talking about these different experiences and phenomena, something that I think sometimes theoretical academics, and I am sure I've been guilty of this myself at various points, do is say, okay, great, we've done a whole lot of this theoretical work, and I think we've now figured out the right language for this, and that means we've solved a problem. And it might mean that, but it might, of course, also mean that there are a whole lot of other practical problems that language can help to address or engage with, but finding the new language in and of itself won't have addressed those issues. And I think that, as I say, especially for theoretically oriented folks, that's a really hard thing to wrestle with. Where that thought goes for me is then also back to the question of practices and relationships. And so it makes me think that part of, again, from a theoretical backgrounded person's perspective, perhaps that idea that we need a universal language, not to say that the questioner was implying this, but if the thought were that we need a universal language that we're all using for this phenomenon A or B, then maybe it's worth stepping back from that idea in favor of saying, well, hang on, part of the skill that folks with these lived experiences and capacities to move between communities have, I was talking about translation before, is that they can code switch, right? As a lot of different scholars of race and other things have spoken about. So they, as a result of their experience, can come into the community and say, well, in fact, they don't need to say, listen, other people talk about this as this, but you all talk about this as that. They can just use that. They can talk about those terms, engage with the people who are in front of them as the people in front of them, and then do that work of doing the translation themselves so that the communities themselves don't have to bother, if that makes sense. So that's been, I'm still very much at the early days of practicing that myself, but it's been really useful to think about.
Thank you. I think one of the things this makes me think about is how we can humanize the abstract frameworks that we often use when we talk about climate change too. And especially how we do that to engage more people with the importance of understanding why how we treat our world impacts everybody. And that kind of leads into another question from the audience. So bear with me because this one is a little bit long, but I'm gonna work through and you can follow up if you have questions. So this comes from Christine Mueller, who says, "Thank you for sharing your illuminating perspectives about the issues of climate justice. It would be, she would be interested in learning what you were thinking about the following thoughts, the three major issues of justice with climate change. So one is the injustice that vulnerable people who have contributed the least to carbon pollution suffer the most from climate change impacts. The second is how to justly transition to a clean energy and nature-friendly society when both of these aspects involve discriminating between polluters and victims and concern about the identity of specific groups. So how do you identify who the polluters and the victims are? And then at the same time, she says that we must get away from the attitude of us and them. So we must be more collaborative and see everyone as positive agents of change and be open to learning from others. And this is especially relevant for the third area of climate justice, which is the injustice toward future generations caused by materialism. And so people everywhere are affected by materialism. And Christine says that we need more solidarity because we're all in this together. So I don't know if you want to tackle all of it or if there are pieces of it. I know that was a big question.
I can chime in to start. I don't think this will answer every part of that question, which is really rich, but I hope can speak to some of it. As I mentioned, or as was mentioned at the outset, I'm at the moment at Stanford. So for folks who might not be familiar, in pretty much in the heart of Silicon Valley, which is a place where a lot of technologies generally, but certainly environmental and green technologies are being developed. And the reason I bring that up is that it's been interesting to see speaking of stories, how one of the narratives that I think can often come through underneath that is there's a few parts. One is perhaps that, the hope, it seems, or fantasy, I would hazard to say, is if we or some of us can invent a technology that's good enough, we'll be able to do things like the question asked, transition to clean energy or take account of the needs of future generations, but in a technocratic way. It sidesteps the intersectional thing that folks were mentioning earlier. That means we don't have to deal with these really thorny things like the aftermath of colonialism. That seems to me to be extremely misguided, to say the least, as a story. The other part of it, and this also taps into the themes the question was raising, is that I've been thinking about this in terms of what I would call separatism or human separatism. The story that some technology or other should be what we try to use first and foremost to solve these issues. When again, often that story is being told by people who are wealthy enough or otherwise powerful enough to not have to deal with the consequences of what happens if things go wrong. Whereas the communities who are trying to find ways to use these technologies and other forms of social and structural change to address the issues that they're facing right now in their own communities, like heat or flooding or other things, can't escape if the technology doesn't work or if the bill of goods they're sold was not helpful or something like that. So that's certainly not a direct answer to everything raised in the question, but it's been that higher level theme for me of where does technology fit into this and how do the values that we have in the background as we're thinking about technologies to solve some of the problems the question raised comes in.
Thank you. Professor Jelks, did you?
Yeah, just kind of there was a lot there. One thing that also, kind of came to mind for me is really, as we were just kind of talking about the technology, that exists, really trying to make that technology more accessible, one reason that in some of the work that I do, I use like low cost sensors is for that very reason. Like, how do we make this technology accessible? How do we try to democratize, science, and, bring people in who are, not, professionally trained scientists, but who have, something to contribute to the efforts. And so when I think about, all of the different types of, injustice that were mentioned and or alluded to, I think about ways that people being engaged in sort of scientific work, even as lay people, can be empowering, and can help them to try to advance the changes that they want to see happen. And so as we think about all of the work that has to be done to really advance climate justice, it's about, we've got to think about, the people and really how they're being impacted, but not only that, how they can empower themselves, to change those realities. Granted, it's going to take more than, that people power, in scientific work to change, to turn all of these inequities, kind of on their heads. But I'm seeing at least a space where people are hopeful as they're engaged in this type of work. But it's about having those tools, including technology, that can kind of work for them to help advance that change.
Thank you. And while we wait for some more questions to come in from the audience, I wanted to give you both an opportunity to see if you had questions for each other.
Thanks. As it comes, I do. I would love to hear, Professor Jelks, I really appreciated the conversation about citizen science, and street science was a term that I hadn't encountered before. So I wondered whether, again, in the spirit of storytelling, were there stories that folks shared with you through the street science outreach you did that really stuck with you or the team? Particular people's experiences of heat, or the way that they've dealt with heat inevitably, or, in their communities that have really stayed with you as you've been doing this work?
Thank you so much for that question. Yeah, as I think about some of the stories that have really resonated, quite honestly, some of it, is the stuff that's, kind of the more heartbreaking stuff, as we have, tried to, get an understanding of what people are dealing with. Lots of stories around, you know, um, like lack of air conditioning, which, in the South, in Atlanta, otherwise known as Hot Atlanta, that's a big deal, to not have things like air conditioning, especially, during the summer months and those times at which it's hottest. And so learning about how people have been coping or trying to cope, with living with extreme heat, has been, very sobering, but also kind of motivating. It really, helps to um, elevate why this work is important and why it's important to kind of spend some time investing in people at the grassroots community level, to not only talk about what the challenges are, but to come up with some of those, solutions. And so those stories are, important, as people are, also making observations. In some cases there have been situations where, and when I talked earlier about, how these inequities are oftentimes layered on top of each other. When I think about, one of the communities in Atlanta that is it's a historically redlined neighborhood, that has some of the lowest percentages of tree canopy in the city. What people have been telling stories about lately is that in some remediation work that the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency has been doing to clean up lead contamination in that very same community, they've been taking down some of the few trees that already exist. And this has, caused, or at least people, believe that it has caused more flooding in the community, as well as increased, temperatures, higher temperatures, in the neighborhood. So they were kind of already dealing with something, but this so-called remedy, from this federal agency is now making things, even worse. And as they have been talking about that, they, were having sort of a difficult, challenge, a difficult time, I should say, in getting, EPA to address that in some way. In terms of, replanting, which doesn't necessarily completely, or at least in the near term, deal with the facts that, there may have been, really old trees that were taken down. But the idea is that over time, if you replant, that these communities will get some relief. But it's kind of, fallen on some deaf ears, but they have, tried now to, engage in some of this more data collection, to bring it together with their storytelling. And it's getting some, some attention and some traction. They've been documenting, some of the flooding events that have happened, and the changes that they're seeing on the landscape and what they're feeling, what they're experiencing. And, that has been something that has been, kind of a glimmer of hope, in terms of, getting at least in some cases where the federal government, it's not necessarily completely, addressing, the issues that the community members are raising up. But now some of the local, agencies are saying, okay, we understand and we will, help in X, Y, and Z ways. So that type of storytelling that has, been helpful in painting the picture of what people are experiencing, and also helpful in, sort of catalyzing some sort of movement toward change. It's been really inspiring, and very helpful. And so with that, I would love maybe to hear a little bit more about, as you, kind of work on these sort of, ethical approaches to engage with communities. How important in the context of environmental challenges are you seeing place? Kind of sense of place, in particular. I know it's very important, in the work that I do, but I'm just curious, how it sort of shows up in the work that you've been engaged in.
That's a really thoughtful question. And the short answer is really a great deal, but sometimes in ways that I think are easy to miss, perhaps. So a few thoughts come to mind. One is that especially with thinking about stories, I wish I could remember the source of this proverb, if it is a proverb, but this idea that the journey might be universal, but the experience of the journey is always unique, right? And so hearing different specific people say, hey, this is happening to us in Redwood City, or this is happening to us in Phoenix. And one of the temptations, if you will, that I think academics sometimes face is, especially if they're doing things like law, is to lift up a level of generality in order to say, okay, I'm going to generalize about these experiences of, say, extreme heat or flooding, because that's going to let me try to advocate for national level regulation or legislation to address this. And it may be the case that, yes, that there are ways in which you need to generalize out or abstract away from the experiences of people and communities to do that. What it seems like, if you want to have action on that level, for instance, what it seems really tricky to square then is how to make sure there's enough moments or enough places and processes where the specifics of that place are coming back in, so that the community who's been affected, who often, and this was a question I had perhaps for you, Professor Jelks, as well, concretely showing up as a researcher or a thinker or a member of these communities in different ways and encountering the mistrust, frankly, that folks often have as a result of saying, listen, a bunch of other people have come and asked us questions, and it wasn't always for reasons that we ended up agreeing with. So why should we tell you anything? I mean, not to say, of course, that is how people always react by any means, but that I think is one way. And then I think as another part of this question of place, I have found it really important for myself to try to counteract that tendency to abstract out. I studied law, which is, I think, one of the really big reasons that I got stuck in this habit of abstracting out. But to counter that, again, by coming back to thinking about stories. And so, I mean, I mentioned before the way in which sometimes place shows up in terms that aren't immediately legible or visible. One of them, I think, for me, in having conversations with particular people, is how the place looms in the background very often of what they're describing. Or there are parts of the story that it turns out you can't understand unless you know, no, this was in Harlem specifically. It adds so much more depth and nuance to the story when you hear, okay, right, I can place that, so to speak, literally. And so, again, finding ways to keep coming back as a researcher, as a friend, as a community partner, whatever role one might show up in, to try to communicate, I want to understand this place. I'm not wanting to understand, again, experience X of people Y in place Z just in order to be able to abstract a principle. I'm hoping to be here. And I mean, and my experience in this is hard, is that often that is, in fact, involves a really human thing of, and if you will, simple, but in deceptive terms, showing up repeatedly, right? Not leaving when things are done. So that you're showing the community you're working with, I want to try and value this place that you all love through my actions and not just through speech, for instance.
Thank you both. I think that feeds nicely into the next question from the audience, which is specifically for Professor Jelks. That comes from Stephen Ako. How do the participants in Atlanta motivate each other to continue their data collection?
That's a great question. Thank you. They motivate each other to continue their data collection. Recently, I'm seeing something that I hadn't seen before. It's folks kind of getting together, like meeting up to do some of the data collection. This summer, we ran for the first time what we call sort of a community champions cohort of community members from different parts of the city who actually developed their own sort of research questions around extreme heat, and they some of them, got together to help each other out, to sort of motivate each other, to just to kind of be in community with each other, and to talk about what they were finding. And, in some cases they were, meeting up in, different neighborhoods. Like if, one person, lived in X neighborhood, others would kind of come together with that person, and they would, take a walk and collect data and talk about it. And then I think because we had sort of put together a space where they could come back and look at that data together, and talk about it, that it kind of has sparked a lot of really interesting kind of relationship building, amongst those participants, amongst the community researchers who are engaged in the work. And that just seems to be, motivating fellowship, being able to get together to discuss what they're finding, and then thinking about solutions. That tends to be something that motivates folks as well, because, there is, I think, I can't remember what comment was made earlier, kind of about the fatigue, right, that, communities experience, especially if they're a ton of folks in their neighborhoods asking them questions. And believe me, that definitely happens quite a bit in Atlanta. There's so many academic institutions here, and a lot of big academic institutions here, so that tends to be something that happens. But community members are definitely motivated by working with each other. They also seem to be very motivated by things that are their ideas, right? That are just not somebody else's idea of what needs to be researched. I see a lot more, passion, when they're trying to get down to the bottom of something that impacts them and that, is on their list of priorities. So those are the types of things that I'm seeing, people sort of tap into, to motivate each other to continue the work.
I wonder if I might just chime in very briefly on that same question, Kate, because I think
Of course.
something really heartening that I have been seeing about, I think, as you say, this really crucial question of motivation, again, goes back to process and relationship. So two brief thoughts. One is, and I certainly wouldn't want to assume that, lots of the folks in the audience are academics by training or in background, but I do think one of the things that happens in academics and with project design and things is that it's easy to design a thing and then put it out in the world and have a moment when the project is starting off that the community, I mean, the analogy for me would be like telling a story to a person. And you're telling the story, you get to the bit that you think they're going to love and they're just cold. You tell the other some other little half anecdote that you didn't realize was supposed to be the story, and they light up and they think, well, that's it. That's what we want to talk about. And so as an academic, trying to find ways to A, see those moments, and then B, not panic, so to speak, and say, like, my study is this. But instead be able to say, okay, wonderful. Part of the process goal of this is to have folks involved, have folks feeling like they own this, and to build relationships and trust that will lead to this being sustainable in a human sense, that folks want to keep doing this, that they see the value of this, that it broadens their own worlds. And I really like Professor Jelks' stories, I think, too, because they also, for me, speak to that. Yeah, walking together, talking together, having a meal after you've done it. I was thinking of friends who've done that with the Christmas bird survey that was mentioned. And it's a quirky group of folks, and it's, they wander around in the bush and it's incredibly cold and they're taking snaps of these robins, but they love it. And it's become a thing they do every year. And several of them now travel hundreds of miles to do it together. And so this idea that humans to do these great things and start rituals and fun community activities, and if one can start that, and even if that wasn't the expectation and it gets going, fantastic, right? Let it run. See what little support or nudges or enthusiasm can be offered so that people keep getting out there in their rain boots and watching the birds or whatever it might be to have that happen.
Absolutely. And I think that's a good point for us to stop. We're running out of time, but I think it's a really nice place to end with a focus on the importance of relationships and kind of human capacity to actually come together to work to solve our problems. So I'm going to hand back over to Professor Mahmoudi now, but I wanted to thank you both again for your presentations and for your insights in the discussion as well.
Thank you so much, Kate. And I have to thank both of you, Dr. Mylius and Professor Jelks, for not only contributing a chapter to this volume, but also for sharing with us what the content of those chapters are about. And then, of course, the rich Q&A that we just experienced, where you've given all of us some very good ideas about what many of us can engage in terms of the communities that we live in terms of this whole question of how to bring more climate justice to this world. So I really appreciate your willingness to be a part of this program. So much to think about and so much then to create an environment in which we can get out there and do something. In other words, take action in order to add to something positive to this whole area, which is so profoundly important for the entirety of this planet. I think your work really reminds us of how building a just and sustainable future requires participation on all of our parts, that everyone should be engaged in this activity. And you've given us some great perspectives on how we might confront this problem. So I thank you both very much. Now, before I conclude, I'd like to bring your attention to our next event, which is on November 19 of this, in fact, it's next week, next Wednesday, How Schools Make Race, Teaching Latinx Racialization in America. It features Dr. Lara Chavez Moreno, who is at the Department of Chicano, and Central American Studies and Department of Education at UCLA. I think her talk will be very interesting because she's done some amazing research in this whole area of race and how schools make race. So Please keep this in mind, sign up for this event. And again, my thanks to our speakers today, and we look forward to seeing you next week. Thank you very much.